Hi everyone, so thank you for coming back to us. Last week we discussed the period of the late Ottoman Empire in Jerusalem, and I would like to go a bit back to the things we discussed just to give us a context. What I mentioned was that since the middle of the 19th century we see rapid development in Jerusalem, following sets of reforms in the Ottoman Empire itself and growing involvement of European powers within Jerusalem landscape, social realm, and politics. And we also discussed how Jerusalem became this sort of a small bubble of cosmopolitan culture, and it was quite represented in the new downtown, the new city that developed outside Jaffa Gate, and a city that was characterized by multiple nationalities and cultures, especially from the Mediterranean Sea and this area. And now we come into our area, and the last period ended up with World War I. And World War I was quite devastating for the land in general, and most concretely to Jerusalem. If at the beginning of the war, there were 70,000 people living in Jerusalem, and I would like to correct a mistake from last class, it was 70,000 up to this point in 1914. Following the war, the population reduced in almost a half. Only 40,000 residents were left in Jerusalem. The most rapid decrease in population was among the Jewish population, that decreased from 45,000 to 25,000. Why did the population of the city diminish so much? That was because of two reasons. One is that the Ottoman authorities expelled almost anyone that had foreign citizenship. And as I explained in last class, many of the Jerusalemites came to the city because they had foreign citizenship, mostly European, and therefore they had a safeguard status, a secure status within the city. So those people were expelled from the country during the war. And another reason was diseases and plagues that tear apart the city, and hunger, because all elemental activities stopped in the land during the war, the agriculture, the commerce, and etc. The access to the city and outside was limited, and therefore many of the city residents have suffered dramatically. And now we come into the turning point in December 1917, when the British forces, following a successful campaign in the Sinai Peninsula, are entering Palestine from the south and coming to Jerusalem. The conquest of Jerusalem became, let's say, the cherry, I would say, in the ice cream of the victory of the British forces in the Middle East. And there is a very funny story kind of illuminating the encounter between the British soldiers coming from the west and the small local Jerusalemite community. On the morning of the 9th of December, the mayor of the city, Hussein al-Husseini, he woke up and realized that all the Ottoman forces have left the city already. The British forces didn't enter yet. They were sitting in Lifta, which is the entrance to Jerusalem today, a few kilometers away of the old city. So he goes around, he arranges this white flag that we can see in this picture. Hussein al-Husseini is the person that we see in front holding the walking stick. And he collects this kind of small commission of respectable people from Jerusalem, and also, as you can see, some young people that join the party, as you can imagine. At the same time, this British regiment that sits in Lifta, they wake up in the morning and they have nothing to eat. They weren't prepared yet, so they send two cooks, Private Church and Andrews, to go up and bring some eggs and something to eat. And those two groups meet. They meet at the entrance of Jerusalem in the site near the central bus station. And as the urban legends say, the Hussein al-Husseini come and gives the surrendering notice to those two cooks at this place, and they of course they refuse. They say, no, you can surrender to us. I will go back to the regiment and send someone for you. And they go forward, and then they meet two sergeants, Cedric and Hercombe, that again refused to accept the declaration of surrender, but they did accept the idea of taking a photograph together, and this is the photograph that we see in front of us. These are the mayor with the two sergeants. But going forward on, even this surrender was not accepted, and their commander, Major General Shaw, demanded that he will receive the surrender. He went up and they did the ceremony once again, but this surrender was again cancelled by General Allenby that came to Jerusalem 3 days later. So this is kind of an urban legend about how Jerusalem surrendered 3 or even 4 times in the hands of various British soldiers. But maybe the most photogenic and iconic moment of the British conquest over Palestine was the entrance of General Allenby in the 12th of December in the gates, 11th of December, sorry, into the gates of Jaffa Gate, walking into Jerusalem. And Allenby insisted on walking by foot into the gate, and not on top of his horse. And he said, as people said that were with him mentioned later on, he said that if Jesus walked barefoot into the city, he himself cannot afford himself walking in a prouder position. And it resembles the way that the British authorities saw the conquest over Jerusalem, not only them, the British press and the American press. This moment was celebrated not just as another military victory, but actually the return of the Holy City into Christian hands after almost 7 centuries of Muslim rule. So we see a kind of religious enthusiasm that was connected to this moment, even though United Kingdom was not a religious state by definition, still they gave it a religious meaning. And also saw the task of gathering Jerusalem and developing its future as something that they can be proud of, and they had this kind of important mission in their hands, and they will show the world how well they did to Jerusalem. And I want to stop for a moment for a bit wider context. But before that, I would like to say 3 things. Maybe the most important thing, the 2 most important things that the British mandate impacted Jerusalem was, first, urban planning and development, and the second one was actually the intensification of the conflict between the Zionists and the Palestinians in the city. And in 30 years, the city has changed again quite rapidly in its urban structure, but also the division between the two populations grown wider and wider in these 30 years. So when we talk about modern urban planning at that point, we discuss what was relatively a new idea, because cities, most of them through the 19th century, developed organically. Some of them were rebuilt, like Paris and London, again, but most of the cities, especially Jerusalem, they just developed, along main routes and etc. If you need a theater, let's find a place for a theater, but there was no plan in a city as Jerusalem. And the idea in modern urban planning that city development must begin with a concrete plan, a plan on a paper. Another thing that characterized the early modern urban planning is the way they saw cities at that time. Cities in the West, especially in England, but also in West Europe, were connected to issues of pollution, industry, crime, social distress. Think about London in the 19th century, Charles Dickens, poverty, orphans running in the street, and etc. The city was a problem to them, the modern city. And they started developing new ideas of what would be the best city that we can create, what is a healthy city. And one of those dominant ideas was written by Howard Ebenezer, a thinker, a British thinker. He wrote a book about garden cities. And he proposed the new idea, let's create healthy cities outside existing cities, with a lot of emphasis on green belts, on private houses that must be surrounded by greenery. We must divide between residents and employment and industry and business sector. The city should be a conglomerate of these separate, let's say, patches. The idea later was called zoning, which is a very important principle in modern planning. So that was one idea, the garden cities. And coming back to Palestine, we see that the way they thought of establishing new communities following the British invasion and British mandate was, in many cases, following the idea of the garden city. Another novel idea, which concerned mostly the idea of designing the house itself, was modern architecture and the international style. What is modern architecture? The idea is that we should see how factories are built. We should get an inspiration from constructions that are very abstract and functional, and this is the way we should design our houses. We should get rid of all these rich and kitsch motifs that we add to our houses with arches and and just create the simplest forms of living with clean lines, aesthetic, but very simple and functional. That was another idea, and that's the background to the urban planning of Jerusalem during this period. And what is amazing about the British Mandate period is that in 30 years, they produced 5 urban plans, city plans to the city of Jerusalem. What is funny is that even since 48 up till today, there were less urban plans produced for Jerusalem, only 4, as you can see in this table. So this reflects the fact that the British authorities were highly invested in the idea, how can we shape and reshape the development of the city? And it was very important to them because they were afraid that if the city will continue to develop as it was during the Ottoman period, it would not conserve its historical importance, its historical environment, and etc. And I would like to go through some of this plan just to emphasize how these ideas were later implemented in the landscape of Jerusalem. Some of them were left aside. This is the first plan initiated by Sir William Hanna Maclean, a Scottish engineer. And he was invited by Allenby himself to come and give this kind of, we call it a master plan. It's not a statutory plan, it's not a law, but just an idea, general idea, guiding principles for the development of Jerusalem. And maybe I'll move forward for a simpler version of the plan. That was the origin, and this is a bit simpler. It's in Hebrew, but I will explain. There are 2 important principles that we will see later on in many of the plan. The first one is the conservation of the old city. No new development were allowed within the city walls from now on. Not only within the city walls, but also it was highly limited in the green belt surrounding the walls themselves. So what did they try to realize in this idea was we want to keep the old city with these views and orientalistic domes and etc. as it was. This is a biblical landscape for us, and this is the way we want to conserve it. In other words, the British authorities, especially those concerned with planning, saw Jerusalem as a sort of museum in which the people living in it are a kind of a problem they need to deal with. But this museum should be kept for generations ahead. In this plan, we also see that he gave a lot of emphasis on the improvement of the new city. all those linear roads that we see, the grids and the circles in the middle of the city. This proposal is actually quite aggressive. We see that McLean didn't really give a notice to the topography of the city too much, or to existing forms and structures of the neighborhoods. But he did want to improve its future development. Another plan, which, as you can see, came later on, Geddes' plan, and later he collaborated with another planner called Ashby. Geddes is also a Scottish planner, and he became kind of one of the house planners of the Zionist movement. He produced the first plan, for example, for Tel Aviv, which was also designed by the principle of the garden cities. And for him, what McLean tried to do to the West City was blasphemy. You can't just come and put a network on existing city. You need to add only very delicate roads, as we can see. He proposed some linear roads that kind of follow the topography, very gentle interventions. And for him, it was very important to preserve in the brown areas here the viewpoints on the old city of Jerusalem from the east. He also came up with the idea that the university, the Hebrew University that was already in planning, should be in the area of Mount Scopus, watching the old city and the Temple Mountain. We go a bit further. In 1930, the first linear plan was produced by Patrick Holliday. And the difference between a linear plan and a master plan is that the linear plan is actually a law. It's regulatory. It's not guiding principles. It's the way things should be. And the most dominant thing in this plan is the idea of zoning, which I mentioned before. Where do we put residential units in the city? Where is the business sector of the city? Where is the green patches of the city? And where is the industry? We have to divide between them as much as possible. So, for example, the white area are residential areas in here, and the light purple is industry. This is near the train station. And in the middle, the deep strong purple, it's the commercial areas along Jaffa Road. So another principle that was in Holliday's plan was an emphasis on the building materials in Jerusalem. It started early on, but now it became a law. You can only build with a Jerusalem stone, a limestone with a very special technique of how to carve it. The way they used the stone that they used in generations, for generations in Jerusalem. And the idea is that any new development around the city should not be in a different language than what we see in the old city itself. And another restriction was the height of the buildings, up to 4 stores for residential and 5 or 6 for business housings. And again, the lowering of the houses around the old city indicates the idea that, the important thing, the cubicle is the old city. Nothing should overpower it around it. And again, we see that the notion of Jerusalem as a museum, and the problem is the people living in it. And another thing that we can see that there were high restrictions on industry in Jerusalem. As I said, there were some areas designed for industry, but the type of industry that was allowed in Jerusalem was, I would say, a small-scale industry, small workshops, up to 40, 50 workers, not mass industry. And this restriction, together with the idea that you can build only with stone, created great obstacles for the development of the business sector in Jerusalem from now on. It was never a very strong business city or industrial city, but those restrictions even kept it behind and gave, I would say, the front seats in the industrial development in Palestine to the cities of Tel Aviv and Haifa. An issue that until today Jerusalem is struggling with. The last plan by the British is the linear plan by Henry Kendall, and here we can already see that Jerusalem boundaries are much more expanded, and the city is growing rapidly. I won't say too much about this plan, but the idea was, again, you see how the British authorities saw that through the tools of urban planning, they can impose a different urban development to Jerusalem, one that is quite restricted and in low profile as much as possible, because the idea is the conservation of its heritage. One of the things that they did develop, the British authorities, was one avenue that was actually the only avenue constructed by the British during the time, the King George Avenue, that was inaugurated in 1924. And this sign, if you go to King George Street today, number 2, on the big crossroad with Jaffa Road, you can still see this sign on the same building that it was put on back then in 1924. And 3 persons were honoring this ceremony. The first is the High Chancellor, Sir Herbert Samuel. The second is Sir Ronald Storrs, which I'll go back, the governor of Jerusalem. And the last one is Rajib Big Nashashibi, the Arab mayor of Jerusalem. And here I would like to say a few words about the relationship between the British colonial authorities and the city management itself. It wasn't a regular colony, Palestine, because we are already talking about late colonial period. The idea behind the mandate is that we are allowing the native peoples to kind of rearrange themselves, consolidate their institutions up to the point where they would be ready for independence. So we are here temporarily, right? And for this reason, the British authorities, for example, did not build by themselves too many buildings in Jerusalem itself, and did not invest directly in the city space, but mostly encourage the business sector and other organizations to do that. They created the framework that allowed the native groups to work within them. But still, it was a very centralistic government. You have the High Chancellor, the High Commissioner, the first one, Sir Herbert Samuel, which was a British Jew, and the fact that the British authorities installed a Jewish High Commissioner in Palestine was a sign for the Zionists, as these are Messiah days. This is the road for a national home for Jerusalem. Of course, this is the period 3 years after the Balfour Declaration, and etc. On the other side, the Palestinians saw it as one of the biggest threats, right? This is a scheme against us. And Sir Herbert Samuel had to invest a lot into showing everyone that he is actually objective and not in any side of the rivaling factors in the land. And still we see that there is a government to Jerusalem, which is Sir Ronald Storrs. And Sir Ronald Storrs is actually the figure that created the ideas of development and conservation in Jerusalem. They say that there are 3 big constructors in the history of Jerusalem: Herod, King Herod, Teddy Kollek, but in the middle it's Sir Ronald Storrs. The idea of the construction with the Jerusalem stone, the conservation of the old city, this is all Ronald Storrs. And below them we see the mayor of Jerusalem, Rajib Bik Nashashibi. For the British authorities, it was always important to keep what they call the status quo. If up until now, Jerusalem always had a Muslim mayor, this custom should be maintained, even though that already in that period of time, Jews are a majority in Jerusalem. But that doesn't matter. The mayor should be Muslim, and he should have 2 deputies, a Christian deputy and a Jewish deputy. They didn't want to steer, I would say, the pot too much, and they said, if this was the arrangement before, we should continue doing it during our era. But again, the mayor himself and the municipality were quite weak because as we can see, it's a very centralist. You have a commissioner and you have a governor of Jerusalem, and the mayor is left to dealing with the petty things like maybe sewage and stuff like that. This is the ceremony of the inauguration of the fifth King George Avenue. Again, you can see the impact. The idea this is not a colony, but the main avenue is named after our king and still named so today. And it was a major thing because that was the first paved road in Jerusalem, and a pre-planned road. All the roads and all the streets in Jerusalem up to this point were organic, ancient roads that developed, or some alleys that people made by themselves between the alleys. But this was the first kind of major road built in Jerusalem, and it was built in the way, and maybe I'll go back to one of the plans showing the road. Here we can see that this is the route of King George Avenue, and the idea was to connect the city center to the train station in this kind of archway road. And this is a quote by Ronald Storrs that kind of illuminates the way he thought about his job in Jerusalem. Every effort was made to get in touch with the people and to give them interest and recreation, tending to bring them into contact with each other and with the gathering race. A chess club was founded, a tournament held, of which the first 4 prizes were won by Jews and the 5th by military government. A school of music was founded for both sexes. A salon of academy of painting, sculpture, textile, architecture, and town planning will be held next spring, and every effort is being made to develop the cultural side of the people. So we can see in this quote again this kind of Orientalist notion, the way the British saw themselves as, bringing the right culture, the Western culture, to the city of Jerusalem and to its people. They will educate them how to be civilized and modern in many ways, and they did invested in this route. Another thing that Storrs established was the Committee for Jerusalem. And this committee was established in 1918, and the idea was to developing a common spirit among the communities of Jerusalem. And the goal of this society was the protection and the addition to the amenities of Jerusalem and its neighborhood, including general public works, preservation, and establishment of museums. So you see in the logo how they added the David Star and the Muslim sign and the cross and etc. The 3 religions are combined together, and this is the way they show Jerusalem. There are 3 groups here: Christians, Muslims, Jews. Each one has its own quota, its own areas, but with this association they should collaborate together for the investing in the landscape of Jerusalem. I would like to argue it further. One of the things they did, for example, Storrs is bringing Armenian artists from Turkey of today, Armenians that suffered from the genocide, the Armenian genocide during this period. They moved 2 families that were craftsmen in the area of ceramics to develop in Jerusalem the industry, or the small industry of ceramics, as an idea of let's create a language, an artistic language that will be identified with Jerusalem. So today when you go to the old city and you buy this Armenian pottery, you get the impression that it's always existed in Jerusalem. This is a Jerusalemite thing, but actually it was a deliberate action fostered by its Storrs of recreating something which is Jerusalemite. Another thing that Storrs did was trying to destroy all the new artifacts added to the city walls. His plan was, as I said before, and it was in Geddes' plan, to go back to that, to create this park around the old city gates, but we did talk about the way that Jaffa Gate itself, you had buildings all along the city wall. He really disliked these buildings, and he wanted to take them down. He didn't manage to do that. What he did manage to take down was the clock watch. If you remember the old Ottoman clock watch, that the city residents collected money for it, and they were very proud of them. For stores, that was an ugly thing, something that is kitsch and does not belong to the city walls. He issued the destruction of this clock tower, despite the fact that the resident did want him to stay. And then later on, they rebuilt the tower in Allenby Square. Today it's the Tzal Square. As you see in the style that you can call it a hybrid style. A hybrid style, you see the arches and the domes, this language, but still a hybrid style between the Oriental architecture and modern architecture. For him, that was cleaner, more modest thing to do. Not very successful in my opinion, but this tower didn't survive even much longer because the square itself had a lot of transportation, and eventually they destroyed it also to create a transportation hub around it. We're actually looking now at the same square, then the Allenby Square, today the Tzal Square, but looking westward. And we see one of the constructions of the British authorities. This is the City Hall, a new City Hall they established around this area. And again, we see that the weight of development is moving westwards during the British time. The first municipal building during the Ottoman times were inside the old city. Later on, at the end of the 19th century, they established it in Mamila area near the Jaffa Road, and now it's still on Jaffa Road but westwards. But the way that the British built it, because they didn't want to invest independently and put money on the construction of this house, they asked the Berkeley Bank that were looking for property in Jerusalem. They say, we'll give you a central property if on the second store above your bank you will build a hall for the city council, and that remained the city council of Jerusalem, this building, up to the end of the 80s. Now I want to discuss something else regarding the changing landscape of Jerusalem. And that was what I call the struggle against, the political struggle on this landscape. When we discussed the Jewish population in Jerusalem and during the Ottoman era, most of the Jews living in Jerusalem were either very religious, what we call ultra-Orthodox today, religious Ashkenazi and Sephardic, mostly Ashkenazi communities. The Sephardic population, some of them were the elite of Jerusalem, people that involved themselves with banking, real estate, and etc. But some of them were really poor, like immigrants coming from Morocco or Persia and these areas, living in some of the poor suburbs in Jerusalem. But the Zionist presence, meaning socialist, secular Jews, the Chalutzim, what we call, that started coming to the land of Palestine from the end of the 19th century, with the first Aliyah, and later on, second Aliyah, 1904, and etc., their position towards Jerusalem was very ambiguous. In fact, as I mentioned, Jerusalem for them was, a shtetl. That is a religious city. This is what we escaped from Europe. We can't create the new Jew in Jerusalem. Tel Aviv is the city for us. Tel Aviv is built from scratch. It's a secular city. It's a modern European city, very culturalized and etc. This is where we can create our new ideas. But Jerusalem is a problem. For example, when David Ben-Gurion immigrates to Palestine, it takes him half a year before he visits Jerusalem, even for a visit. This is how much he didn't really was interested in the city. Later on, he does come and live for a couple of years in the city with a small group, but mostly up to World War I, you would come to Jerusalem and most of the Jewish population would be either religious or Mizrahi, poor Mizrahi, and not many representation for the new Zionist wave. But the British authorities, one thing that they did do is they decide that Jerusalem from now on become the capital of the new mandatory Palestine. As I mentioned earlier, under Ottoman regime, Jerusalem, at the end it had its own district, but was quite a marginal city. Here they decide this is the capital of the new Palestine with the new boundaries of Palestine, and this is where we're gonna put our high chancellor, this is where we'll have our government offices, and this is also will be the center of our military activities in the Middle East. So suddenly, Jerusalem gains much more significance than just a religious center. Suddenly, it's a political center. It's a center of activity. That gives a great push for the development of Jerusalem, and it also gives no choice for the Zionist organization or the Zionist activists. Now they have to show their presence, they have to immigrate to Jerusalem and also build their institutions. And this is the first, I would say, not the first, but maybe the most dominant institution is the Zionist executive buildings on King George Avenue. This became the site where I would say the government, then in quotes, the government of the Jewish population set the site of the Jewish Agency, the Kakal, Keren HaYesod, and all the important Zionist institutions at that point of time. But they also need a space for their own people to live in, and that relates to some future development that I will soon discuss. The Palestinians also became much more, they are invested in Jerusalem. Their religious leadership is in some ways beginning to formulate in Jerusalem. Haj Amin al-Husseini, for example, the head of the Muslim Council, was the unofficial leader of the new Palestinian national movement, and he tried to create his own stronghold, architectural stronghold in the city through the Palace Hotel. Palace Hotel is built in a Grand Street, not far away from King David Street, but this endeavor did not succeed. The hotel itself did not succeed financially, and eventually it was leased to the British government that used it as a governmental office. The Zionists had much more power at that time and organizational skills to impose themselves on the landscape, recreate it, and strengthen their presence in it. And coming back to the question, how can we create a space for Zionists in Jerusalem? This comes to a point of time 3 years after the British invasion and conquest of Jerusalem. I think I mentioned it last class. Many of the properties west to the old city belonged actually to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. And they didn't develop this land. They used it for agriculture mostly, and held it. But after the World War I, this church, the Greek church, is in dire position financially. They lost a lot of money during the war. They weakened their position with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And also, most importantly, pilgrims from Russia, which were in many ways the biggest donors or financial, I would say, owners of this church, stopped coming because Russia became a communist state. And once those pilgrims stopped coming, they lost many of their financial sources during this move. And the British authorities come to the church and say, okay, we'll commission a committee, and you have to sell your lands. We need to develop West Jerusalem. You hold all these lands. You're in a dire position. This is the solution. Let's sell your lands. And they sell some tracts of this in big tracts. They didn't sell it individually. The idea was to sell it in big tracts. That are the areas in green that we see it. Janjaria, for example, here. It's harder to see, but also the areas in the city center, in the south, the area of Talpiot. There was a single buyer to this land, almost completely, but 90% of the lands that were sold by the Greek church was bought by the Zionist movement eventually. It was the only big organization that managed to raise enough money to buy these huge tracts of land. And on those new properties, they built the new neighborhoods of Jerusalem, Rehavia in Janjaria, Beit HaKerem, and Beit Vagan, Talpiot, which I mentioned, and Makor Chaim, and also very important, the new city center, the triangle, the Ben Yehuda, King George Haifa triangle. And this has created a new space in Jerusalem that didn't exist before. This is the plan of Rehavia on the lands of Janjaria. And none like the older neighborhoods, which are courtyard neighborhoods, if you remember, in which there is a social inspection and it's built very enclosed against the environment. These are already more kind of modern style, I would say even suburbs. Inspired by the idea of the Garden City, the planner of it is Richard Kaufman, a very known planner, also immigrated to Palestine at that point of time, and plans a lot of those new neighborhoods. And you can see how he invested in greenery, the idea that each house is isolated, it has its own garden, there are avenues in here, and also central buildings were already implemented within the plan ahead. For us today, it seems obvious, of course, this is how you plan, but then it was quite a novel idea. And also think about this change in perception from the courtyard neighborhoods in which everyone is involved in each other's life. You move to a sort of living which is much more, I would say, secular and Western, individualized. Each family lives in its own estate. They have privacy. They can do whatever, basically they can do whatever they want inside the house and nobody will know potentially about it. It's a new reproduction of space, a new space of Jerusalem, of secular Jewish life, in a way. Not that everyone in Rehavia were seculars. Many of them were what we called modern Orthodox, for example, but still, they already adapted the ways of life of the West, and they wanted to get away of the density of the courtyards in Jerusalem. This is an aerial photo of Rehavia in 1931, 5 or 6 years after it was established. As you can see, some of the houses are still in construction. What is interesting about Rehavia, that it quite quickly became the elite neighborhood of the Jewish population in Jerusalem. Up until then, I think I mentioned it, the elite of the Jewish population was the new generation of Sephardic Jews or Ashkenazi Jews belonging to what is called Hayeshuv Hayashan, people who are native to Jerusalem, that grew up in Jerusalem and were living it before Zionism came to Jerusalem. They owned land, they owned properties. They were very much connected in many ways to the Arab Palestinian population through business connection, through language, even through culture in some aspects. But with the intensification of the conflict during the 20s and more so during the 30s, they were kind of more and more, a new divide was created between them and the Palestinian Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem. So this was the first group that actually established Rehavia. I know today when we talk about Rehavia, you think that that's the neighborhood of the German Jews, the Yekes, but no. Actually, the first group that established Rehavia was Sephardic Jews. This is why when you walk in Rehavia, most of the streets are named after known figures from Spain, Jewish figures from Spain in the Middle Ages, Metudela, Abarbanel, and etc. Another group that accompanied them was, I would say, the elite of the Zionist personnel that moved to Jerusalem after 1917, like Osishkin, for example, right, or Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, people that were at the top ladder of the socialist, not all of them were socialist, but the Zionist movement in general. So these two groups are joining hands together, establishing Rehavia, and later on, after 1933, with the rise of Nazism to power in Germany, came a new immigration, the German Jewish immigration, and this German immigration already had a lot of financial resources. They wanted to rebuild their lives, their bourgeois lives that they had in Berlin, in Palestine, kind of trying to reach the same level, quality of life. Many of them suffered immensely from the humidity in the areas of Tel Aviv, and they found Jerusalem as a much more pleasant place to stay. And also, importantly, this is the time where the Hebrew University is already functioning from 1925 and on, and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem is a German institution. Most of the professors are coming from Germany. This is their model, the German institution, and many of those German Jews are coming because they are becoming the lecturers at the university and etc. So a new elite is conceived in Jerusalem, and its base is Rehavia. Very close to Rehavia, there is also a new neighborhood, but a Palestinian one, Talbiya. If Rehavia is very known as the Jewish cherry, this is the Palestinian cherry. A site of around 30 villas. Most of the people living there are Christian Arabs. There were some Muslim Arabs, but most of them are Christians. If the Sephardic Jews were the elite of Jerusalem up to this point, the Christian Arabs were becoming the new, I would say, the wealthier families in the era of the British mandate. During the Muslim era, they had some financial aids, but the British offered them new position in the government and also cultural ties, and that was an emerging elite at that time, the Christian Arab community. Not like Rehavia, Talbiya is not pre-planned. Talbiya is just an area that was divided into plots and sold to anyone who wanted without any general guides to how you build your house or in what style or in what way. An organic community. It's interesting to talk about Talbiya and Rehavia at the same time because they were developed at the same time. In a way, they are twin neighborhoods, but they were sitting with the back to each other, right? One elite of one population, second elite of a different population, and as the tension rises, also this invisible war between them rose at the same time. In fact, if we talk about South Jerusalem at that point of time, the area of Talbiya, Katamon, the German colony, Bakain, etc., it was a rapidly developing area for elite groups among the Palestinian population. And here we see some of those beautiful villas that those residents built. Villa Salame in Talbiya, in a Bauhaus style. Villa of Hana Zananiri in Katamon, also in the international style. And Cherkessi Villa, this is also in Katamon, in Rachel Imenu streets today. This is more kind of Orientalist, eclectic style. But we see that, those architectural trends affected everyone in Jerusalem, the Jewish and the Arab population as one. A new habitat was created in South Jerusalem. I would say a Christian European habitat, south to Rehavia, in those neighborhoods that I mentioned. It's not only housing that you founded, but also important institutions, especially Christian institutions. For example, the Terra Santa, that started as a Franciscan monastery and became a high school, a British high school. And today, it's between Rehavia and Talbiya. This is where the kids that lived in Talbiya or Katamon went to school to. You get a British diploma at the end of your studies, and you can go to any university in Europe you would like afterwards. IMCA, YMCA, and the Katamon Sports Club were the place where they recreated. They would play tennis in the Katamon Sports Club to get together with the British officers' families that also lived in this habitat, or they went to listen to a concert in YMCA or swim in the first public swimming pool that were built in the YMCA. If we look at it geographically, I'll go further to a map. In 1945, we can see that the city is divided along these ethno-religious identities, again with some modes of separation between them. Most of the Jewish populations, these are the blue dots, the blue areas, are living in the northwest side of the city, along Jaffa Road, right? South and north to Jaffa Road, from Sanhedria in the north, to Rechavia area in the south. This was the biggest, most important concentration of Jewish population in Jerusalem. Of course, within it there was much diversity. For example, in this area in the south, that was the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, some of them. In the middle, around Jaffa Gate Road, the areas of Nachlaot and Machne Yehuda, mostly Mizrahi, poor population. And if you go to the south, Rechavia, the new Ashkenazi elite that moved to the city. Also, we have new Jewish suburbs around the city. Beit HaKerem, Beit Vagan, Talpiot. They were not included into the municipal area of Jerusalem. This is why if you go and you see some of the historical buildings, they are not built in a Jerusalem stone, because this regulation did not abide them. They were outside of Jerusalem, but again, part of the Jewish population. The Arab population is divided into, I would say grossly, 2 or 3 areas. You have the old city, in which mostly are either Muslim or Christian, and of course there is the Jewish quarter, but again a small area within the old city. But the old city is still kind of the heart, the religious heart of the Muslim and the commercial heart of the Arab population in the city. Some of the Muslims and Christians moved to the north of the cities. I showed some of their houses last class, but when we talk about South Jerusalem, this is the new elite area I discussed. Talbieh, Katamon, the German colony, after 1939, when the British expelled the Templars, it became a kind of British colony actually, and Baka. So we see that if today we talk about East and West Jerusalem, actually the situation was a bit different. It was southeast Arab Palestinian, northwest Jewish. The boundaries were different. And also what we can see that there are not a lot of mixed areas between them. There is still a very clear division. We live together, but separately. We do have a combined city center. And if we go back to the properties that the Greek Orthodox Church had to solve, one of them was in the city center of today. Again, planned by Richard Kaufman. He created this urban corridor, very much in a European style, but still you see the houses are quite low in stores, abiding the rules. Everybody are building in Jerusalem stone. It was built by the Zionist movement de facto, but in reality many of the buildings themselves were built by Arab contractors. For example, the Sansur house, which we see here, which is one of the most notable houses in the city center, are built by 2 Arab brothers, the Sansur brothers, that were living in Katamon. And this was the first office building in Jerusalem, and the largest of them up until the 60s, actually. So, coming back to the reality in Jerusalem, we talked about the urban planning, the urban development, and some of the Jewish-Arab spatial relationship, the emergence of new elites. And Jerusalem is prospering in many ways during the area of the British mandate. Think about it's a central place. The elites live there. The elites of the country live there. The political elite, the cultural elite. In some ways, it's true that Tel Aviv still gave quite a competition to Jerusalem on the population side. But if we talk about the larger population, this is the seat of the biggest military base in the Middle East during World War II. You have many people coming to Jerusalem all the time, tourists, soldiers, spies, escaped novelties from Ethiopia or Poland or even Spain. Jerusalem is a hub, and the city is prospering because of its society. These conditions. So the business are prospering and etc. You can make a good life in Jerusalem by the 30s, but things are the same time it's developing that in a good way. At the same time, the threat of the escalating conflict between Zionism and the Palestinian movement is growing at the same time. I won't go too deep in that because that's not the focus of the course, but I would say that in 1929, around the events in the West Wall, we see the first signs of mass violence, inter-community violence in Jerusalem, incitement against each other, and growing, I would say, boundaries. For example, after the 1929, many of the Jewish businesses that were situated in the old cities are moving to the new city center. And this invisible line starts to create itself between East and West, especially between the old city and the new city. And what is happening, the picture that we see how the King's David Hotel after bombing is actually a terrorist act by extremist Jewish fractions, the Lehi, that are seeing their struggle at this point of time not as much against the Palestinian movement, but actually against British imperialism. And they do several very deadly terrorist acts in Jerusalem, which creates a large friction between Haganah, the left, the Jewish left, and themselves, but also creates a situation in which the British authorities become very much hostile towards the Jewish population in general, on one hand, on the second hand, they really want to leave Palestine as soon as possible. It becomes a big headache for them. In King David itself, the reason they bombed this hotel, that this part of the hotel, the southern part of the hotel, was used by British command officers, armistic military users, and etc. And more than 70 people were killed in this bombing. So following this terrorist act, the British are kind of creating for themselves islands, barricaded islands, 3 barricaded islands within Jerusalem. One of them is in the city center, the other is the area of Rehavia and Talvia, the other one is in the German colony. You can't enter these areas without showing ID. There are checkpoints at the entries. If any Jewish population accidentally lived within these areas, there were, or Arab population, they were moved away. They're in a state of war, they're barricaded themselves, you don't want us here. We'll stay here, arm ourselves until this thing is over. And eventually, we come into the end of the class. In October 1947, the UN resolution, the famous UN resolution of divided the country into a Jewish state and an Arab state, and keeping Jerusalem as an ex-territory, an international island between those two states. This solution was adopted reluctantly, but approved by the Zionist movement, rejected by the Palestinian population, the Palestinian leadership. Of course, we won't go into the reasons of that, but that was the reality. And a civic war breaks out in November, the following month. It begins as a civil war between small gangs, the Haganah, the Etzel, Palestinian small military, semi-military units. For half a year, there is a civil war in Palestine, and Jerusalem is in the midst of it as the biggest mixed city, of course, a symbolic center, and the population is suffering. For the first half of year, the upper hand is on the Arab side. They managed to enclose, to put a curfew on Jewish Jerusalem. especially on the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road. The Jewish population in Jerusalem is suffering from hunger, from poverty, and a lot of fear from bombing and attacks. And if you came to Jerusalem in April, for example, 1948, and talked to the Jews there, they would say, we are about to lose. That was the feeling in Jerusalem. This situation is changing in May. First of all, the 15th of May, the British troops are leaving Palestine. The mandate is over. The state of Israel is established in Tel Aviv because they can't do it in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is under siege. And the Arab countries are going into the battle now with their armies, either if it's the Egyptian army, the Jordanian army, and also some small units of the Syrian, Iraqi army, and etc. The Jordanian army is actually the most professional and well-trained army from all of the Arab armies involved in the battle, and they do manage during the fights to take hold of the old city after Maine, all parts of the old city, including the Jewish quarter, and some of the Arab neighborhoods north and south to the old city. But if we go back to the map I showed you before, the Israeli forces, Tzahal, managed to conquer and occupy all of South Jerusalem, meaning all the elite neighborhoods that we just talked, the pride of the Arab population in Jerusalem was now under Israeli control. Talbieh, Katamon, Baka, the German colony, Abu Tor, that was a major blow to the Palestinian population in many ways. First of all, the fact that the people living there, the elites, that supposedly they are the leadership of the population, most of them are escaping during the battles. They are not the ones who are fighting in the military units. They actually flee in their houses. They have the option to do it. You know, they have connections abroad. They have English. They have money. They can take the car in one day and drive from Katamon to Cairo, and many of them did that, or go to Beirut, and etc. So that was a devastating blow morally. The fact that not only the elites escaped, but also their neighborhoods, luxurious neighborhoods, were now under Israeli hands. And the houses themselves became the property of the Israeli government, under the law of what is called the absentee law. We'll talk a bit further about the future of those neighborhoods after 1948. Jerusalem is moving from the Ottoman period, in which it was a cosmopolitan, somewhat mixed city, into a clearly divided city, in which one side, West Jerusalem, is under Israeli control, and only a few Arabs are left, 1,000 approximately, at the Beit Safafa village, the northern part. On east side, under Jordanian rule, you have an Arab Palestinian city, very small one. And that was the reality for the next 20 years, on which we're going to talk about in next class. So thank you very much, and I will see you again.